Chevrolet just pulled the plug on $48 billion of U.S. production, and America is furious. Factories went silent, thousands of workers sent home, and while communities brace for collapse, Chevrolet shifts its future overseas. This isn't downsizing, it's a deliberate exit, and no one was supposed to notice this fast. Why would Chevy risk everything it built in America? Who's actually making the money here? And is this just the beginning of the end for U.S. manufacturing? Stay with me, because by the time this is over, you'll see what they tried to bury. The announcement that changed everything. It began quietly, too quietly. No press conference, no flashing headlines, just a sudden halt in activity at Chevrolet plants across Michigan, Texas, and Missouri. Workers showed up to gates that would not open. Local media caught wind when rows of pickup trucks, SUVs, and electric vehicles stood untouched on freshly paved lots. The silence was deafening, and within 24 hours, the whispers turned into confirmation. General Motors had shut down over $48 billion in U.S. Chevrolet production. Internal documents leaked by a mid-level executive confirmed the magnitude. This was not a temporary pause for retooling or model refreshes. It was a full-scale freeze. Manufacturing lines that once pushed out thousands of Silverados and Tahoes per day were now idle. Shift supervisors were instructed to send employees home indefinitely, many without clarity on severance or return dates. The announcement, or rather the lack of one, sent shockwaves through the industry, not because Chevrolet was failing in the market, but because this decision came at a time when demand was high. The public assumed it had to be a market correction. Maybe EV sales were down. Perhaps the company was over-leveraged. But as more details surfaced, it became clear. This was not about sales, and it was not about supply shortages. The true culprit wasn't inside Chevrolet at all. It was coming from Washington. This wasn't a collapse of confidence. It was the result of policy. Specifically, President Trump's aggressive 25% tariff on imported parts. That policy didn't just shake Chevrolet's operations. It shattered them, and the consequences were just beginning. As analysts scrambled to interpret the damage, a larger question emerged. How could a single trade policy bring one of America's most iconic auto brands to its knees? Tariffs built. This collapse, the policy was clear. A 25% tariff on all imported automobile parts and vehicles not made in the United States. President Donald Trump's trade team presented it as a bold economic reset, punishing offshoring, rewarding domestic manufacturing, and forcing automakers to buy American. But the auto industry is not built on nationalism. It is built on supply chains. And for Chevrolet, those supply chains stretched across the globe. Take the Silverado, Chevrolet's crown jewel. Nearly half its components are sourced from outside the United States. Batteries from South Korea, wiring harnesses from Mexico, semiconductors from Taiwan, braking systems from Germany, and countless electronics from China. Under the new tariff regime, every bolt, chip, and sensor shipped in faced a 25% cost increase. For a company as cost-sensitive and volume-dependent as Chevrolet, the math simply collapsed. Internal cost projections reviewed by financial analysts showed that even with price hikes, General Motors stood to lose nearly $800 million in additional annual costs on the Silverado alone. The Bolt EV became completely non-viable. The lithium battery packs, sourced from China and Malaysia, meant the vehicle would either need a $10,000 price hike or be sold at a massive loss. Chevrolet's mid-size SUVs like the Equinox and Blazer, partially assembled in Mexico, were caught in tariff crossfire and rendered borderline unsellable in domestic showrooms. This wasn't a matter of incompetence. It was the crushing weight of a policy designed with zero tolerance for international complexity. Trump's America First doctrine assumed companies would immediately relocate supply chains to domestic factories. But factories take years to build. Supplier relationships cannot be rerouted overnight. The result was a brand backed into a corner, not by poor planning, but by economic pressure it could not outrun. Chevrolet didn't fail to compete. It became too expensive to stay. That economic pressure, however, was felt most violently not in boardrooms, but on the factory floor. We dug through leaked memos and internal data to uncover this. If you think Chevy had a choice or got cornered, drop your take in the comments. And if this research matters to you, subscribe for more. The workers left in the dark. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Robert Estrada showed up for work at the Chevrolet Arlington assembly plant like he had every day for 22 years. He was a trimline technician, proud of his record and proud of his truck. That morning, security handed him a sealed envelope and told him to wait for instructions. He never clocked locked in again. Robert's story is one of thousands now echoing across the Midwest and South. In Wentzville, Missouri, hundreds of workers found pink slips taped to their lockers. In Michigan, the historic Detroit Hamtramck facility went dark with less than 48 hours notice. In total, more than 17,000 workers were impacted across 5 states. Single mothers, third-generation line operators, skilled technicians, and administrative staff alike were all caught off guard. They were not furloughed. They were silenced. For Anna Doyle, a single mother of 2 in Lansing, the shutdown came with zero explanation. "We were told to go home and wait for a call," she said, "but the call never came. Then my supervisor texted me and said I should start looking for other work." Anna had been with General Motors for over a decade. Her health insurance evaporated with her badge. It wasn't until union leaders leaked internal memos that the full story came into view. Executives had been planning a staged withdrawal for months. HR departments were instructed to halt new hires and quietly reduce overtime in March. Vendor contracts were shortened, but no one informed the workers. Not the UAW, not the local management, not even the mayors whose towns depended on these plants. And that silence, that deliberate vacuum of communication, turned this from a business decision into what many workers now call a betrayal. But the numbers behind the decision, those are even harder to ignore. $48.1 billion gone. That is the estimated total value of Chevrolet vehicle production, frozen or eliminated by this shutdown. It is not just a number. It represents the combined output of 9 core models, 5 facilities, and hundreds of thousands of units annually. Among the hardest hit are the Silverado 1500, Suburban, Tahoe, Laser, Equinox, and the all-electric Bolt. These are not fringe vehicles. They are Chevrolet's lifeblood. Dealerships across the country began receiving stop sale memos. Fleet managers were told existing government contracts would be delayed indefinitely or canceled outright. The Chevrolet website still listed build and price options for vehicles no longer in production. Customers placed orders for trucks that would never arrive. Dealerships scrambled to update inventory systems and reassure buyers, but the writing was on the wall. Chevrolet was shifting away from domestic production on a scale not seen in over 3 decades. Internally, General Motors executives briefed investors that this would be a restructuring of operational alignment. In simpler terms, that means the company is abandoning high-cost U.S. assembly for more affordable manufacturing abroad. The savings may be strategic, but the losses are devastating. Over 100,000 ancillary jobs, parts suppliers, warehouse teams, transportation contractors are now at risk. Chevrolet's rivals are watching closely. Some believe Ford and Stellantis will follow suit in select segments, especially in the electric space. Others think GM's move is a bridge too far, that the public backlash will outweigh the financial gains. But inside Chevrolet headquarters, the decision is already final. This is not a production delay. It is not a short-term supply chain hiccup. This is a structural pivot. The $48 billion in lost production is not coming back. The road forward for Chevrolet and the political firestorm surrounding the collapse is about to explode in full public view. The political firestorm. When Chevrolet announced its U.S. production pause, the political response was swift and deeply divided. President Donald Trump defended the decision to maintain high tariffs on imported auto parts, calling it a patriotic correction to decades of outsourcing and industrial decline. In a televised press conference, he said, "This is what American companies should have dealt with 20 years ago. It's not punishment, it's preparation. Bring the jobs back or find a way to compete." But for state and local leaders, especially those in auto-dependent states like Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, the shutdown felt like a betrayal of the promise that tariffs would revive American industry. Several governors signed an emergency resolution demanding tariff exemptions for auto components tied to domestic assembly. In Indiana, the governor convened a special commission to investigate regional job loss and supplier insolvency, stating if these companies collapse, they don't come back. Capitol Hill was not far behind. Senate hearings were launched to assess the economic consequences of the automotive supply chain collapse. Executives from GM were subpoenaed. Economists testified that a prolonged shutdown could result in a $100 billion hit to the U.S. economy if related manufacturing sectors followed suit. But bipartisan outrage could not overcome partisan inertia. While Democrats pushed to ease tariffs and fund supplier relief packages, Republicans countered with calls for domestic investment incentives. In the end, no consensus emerged. No legislation passed. No tariffs were lifted. Instead, the White House doubled down. Trump's advisors reiterated that short-term pain was necessary for long-term manufacturing independence. "This is the storm before the rebirth," one official said on national radio. But on the ground, it didn't feel like rebirth. It felt like collapse. And as the capital played politics, working-class towns felt the pressure crack their foundations. The blue-collar snap. In Janesville, Wisconsin, the diner across from the old assembly plant sits empty most mornings. It used to open at 5 o'clock sharp to serve the first shift crowd. Now it opens late and only stays open 4 hours. The waitress says she's lucky to have kept her job. "Half my regulars are out of work. The other half are scared they're next." In Flint, Michigan, the story is grimmer. Mortgage payments are going unpaid. Used trucks sit unsold in gravel lots. Grocery stores are quietly cutting staff as food stamp enrollment spikes. Entire neighborhoods that once thrived on steady wages and holiday bonuses are now quiet, anxious, and hollow. The hum of factory life has gone still, and the silence is deafening. Toledo tells a similar story. High school students used to talk about working the line at Chevrolet as a solid, respectable future. Now their parents tell them to leave town. One small business owner said, "I don't think we'll survive another year like this. If GM doesn't come back, neither do we." This isn't just about unemployment, it's about identity. These towns were built around the assembly line, passed down through generations. They weathered recessions, bankruptcies, and automation. But this feels different. It feels like abandonment, like betrayal. Former employees now line up at state offices for assistance. Families who once drove new Silverados now sell household items to cover rent. The pain isn't just economic, it's spiritual. A feeling that something sacred has been lost. One former plant worker summed it up best, his voice steady, his eyes wet. "We gave our lives to this brand, and it gave up on us." Southbound Strategy. What began as a cost-cutting memo inside General Motors' Detroit headquarters has now become a full-blown industrial relocation strategy. Chevrolet's most popular models, the Silverado, Blazer, and even the Bolt EV, are being transitioned out of U.S. plants and into facilities in Mexico and South Korea. For decades, these vehicles symbolized American assembly line excellence. Today, they represent something very different, a calculated retreat. General Motors executives are not apologizing. In a closed-door investor briefing, one board member described the move as long overdue, pointing to a 70% labor cost differential between U.S. and Mexican plants, while American union workers demand fair wages, healthcare coverage, and pensions. Their counterparts in Ramos Arizpe and Silao earn a fraction and rarely protest. That kind of labor math is impossible for any executive to ignore, especially when the company is under pressure to preserve profit margins in an inflationary protectionist economy. Post-NAFTA trade infrastructure has only made the shift easier. Cross-border rail links, tax incentives from the Mexican government, and logistical streamlining mean that moving production south no longer means sacrificing efficiency. In fact, for many models, the logistics are faster and cheaper than shipping across state lines in the U.S. Publicly, GM frames the decision as necessary. "This is not about walking away from America," said one spokesperson. "It's about staying competitive in a very volatile global market." But internally, the tone is different. One leaked executive comment summed it up with cold clarity. "We didn't leave America. America priced us out." As U.S. plants go dark and the silence spreads across former factory towns, the lights are turning on elsewhere, far beyond the border. Wall Street applauds. The very same day that General Motors confirmed its plant closures and overseas shift, the stock market responded with rousing approval. GM shares rose more than 8% before the market even closed. The financial press called it a brilliant pivot, while investor forums buzzed with optimism over the company's newfound discipline. In boardrooms and brokerage apps alike, one thing was clear: Wall Street was cheering. The company's chief executive officer, already a favorite among institutional shareholders, was praised for protecting long-term value in a high-risk environment. Headlines praised her ability to steer through the chaos and unlock shareholder efficiency. Financial analysts released glowing updates, predicting that the cost savings from the Mexico and Korea shift could exceed $3 billion over 5 years, possibly more if additional vehicle lines follow the same path. To the markets, the equation is simple. Fewer workers in Michigan and Missouri means fewer liabilities on the balance sheet. More automation in Mexico and flexible labor contracts in South Korea means leaner margins and higher quarterly earnings. For shareholders, it is a textbook play, but for communities, the praise lands like salt on a wound. In cities like Flint, Arlington, and Janesville, the celebration of cost-cutting feels grotesque. Local officials are watching their tax bases collapse. School boards are holding emergency meetings. Real estate values are already in freefall, and yet the same decisions gutting those towns are being rewarded with green arrows and end-of-day closing bells. This is the modern paradox of American capitalism. A corporation can devastate the towns it once built and still be rewarded for it. As Wall Street smiles, Main Street crumbles. While financial institutions cheer, another continent is preparing a counterattack. China hits back. If General Motors thought its troubles would end with relocating production, it underestimated the international response. Within days of the U.S. plant closures, Beijing announced a retaliatory tariff package, specifically targeting American-built SUVs and pickups. The move sent shockwaves through the automotive export world and put Chevrolet's global strategy in jeopardy. Cadillac exports, already teetering under stiff competition, stalled almost overnight. GM's China division, once a crown jewel in its international portfolio, started losing ground to native brands like Build Your Dreams and Geely. Chinese consumers, now flush with domestic EV options, began turning away from imported American models that suddenly cost thousands more due to tariffs. But this was not just about pricing, it was about perception. In a politically charged consumer environment, buying American became an act of economic disloyalty. Chinese influencers, previously known for showing off Escalades and Silverados, began highlighting BYD sedans and Neo crossovers. GM's identity as a premium export player in Asia started fading. The consequences are bigger than any one company. A shift is occurring in the global auto economy. Asia is closing its doors to Detroit while building its own industrial strength. Meanwhile, U.S. automakers are retreating, not just from China, but from the very markets that once fueled their expansion. With every move to shore up profits at home, GM risks becoming a regional player in a world that demands global resilience. And as Chinese tariffs lock out American vehicles, it's clear that Chevrolet's attempt to protect its bottom line has inadvertently cost it one of its most vital export avenues. From Detroit to Beijing, the message is spreading. America is no longer seen as the stable supplier it once was. In this strange inversion of fortunes, the future of Chevrolet might be Mexican-made and proud of it. Union mobilization. The tension that had been building for months finally exploded into action. Outside shuttered plants in Ohio, Michigan, and Missouri, workers began gathering in force, not for their shifts, but for picket lines. What began as scattered protest quickly turned into a coordinated resistance, with the United Auto Workers launching rolling strikes across key Chevrolet-linked suppliers. One by one, the gears of American manufacturing ground to a halt, not from a lack of demand, but from a rising refusal to be erased quietly. The atmosphere at these blockades was not chaotic. It was calculated. Veterans of past strikes stood shoulder to shoulder with younger hires and retirees who hadn't worn their union jackets in decades. They carried signs that didn't just demand wages. They demanded dignity. "We built this brand," one placard read. "We're not disposable." Across social media, the hashtag number Bring Chevy Back began to trend as videos of picket lines went viral. Americans watched as workers stood in the snow, in the rain, and under the searing Midwestern sun, refusing to let Chevrolet's decision go unanswered. The union's leadership took the movement national. Spokespeople appeared on morning shows, in live streams, and even at political rallies, declaring that if Chevrolet continued its shift to Mexico, a nationwide walkout would follow. Parts plants feeding General Motors' domestic operations were warned. Close ranks or be shut down. The UAW wasn't just protecting jobs, it was defending the soul of American labor. For decades, unions had watched manufacturing erode under the pressure of globalization. But this time, they weren't going quietly. And with public sympathy growing, they didn't have to. As the picket lines spread and pressure mounted, it wasn't just unions making noise. A very different kind of backlash was forming outside the factories. One made not of striking workers, but of angry buyers. The Customer Revolt. It started with a single video. An Iraq War veteran in Kentucky filmed himself returning the keys to his Silverado at a local dealership. "I bought this truck because it was American," he said, looking straight into the camera. "But Chevrolet doesn't think that matters anymore." That clip, raw and emotional, spread like wildfire. In days, hundreds of similar videos flooded social media. Families returning vehicles, small business owners canceling fleet contracts, longtime Chevy fans taping notes to their windshields that read, "No longer loyal." Influencers began joining the chorus. Auto YouTubers, veterans organizations, and blue-collar content creators began to publicly denounce the company. The messaging was consistent. This wasn't just about trucks or tariffs. This was about betrayal. One podcast host put it bluntly, "When you offshore jobs and hike prices, that's not capitalism. That's corporate cowardice." Even among those who weren't politically active, the shift was palpable. Chevy loyalists who once defended the brand now admitted they felt burned. In working-class suburbs across Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Wisconsin, longtime customers shared the same sentiment. "We backed Chevy through the bailouts. We bought during the downturns. Now they're turning their backs on us." The damage wasn't just emotional, it was visible. Dealerships reported a noticeable uptick in cancellations and walkouts. Rival brands like Ford, Toyota, and even Ram began offering incentives targeting disillusioned Chevy owners. Some dealerships displayed American flags alongside posters reading, "We still build here." The message was clear, and it was working. Chevrolet wasn't just losing workers, it was losing believers. And in that vacuum of public trust, a political firestorm was waiting to erupt. Trump versus GM, the final clash. The moment President Donald Trump took the stage in Des Moines, the message was already clear. This would not be a routine speech. The crowd roared as he declared, "If General Motors wants to build Chevys in Mexico, they can sell them in Mexico, not here." Within minutes, headlines exploded. Trump was calling for a 100% import tariff on any Chevrolet vehicle built outside the United States. It wasn't just posturing. The proposal had teeth and political momentum. Conservative lawmakers drafted emergency legislation under the banner of a Manufacturing Loyalty Act, tying corporate tax rates to domestic job retention. Trump allies in Congress called Chevrolet's offshoring move unpatriotic profiteering and accused the automaker of betraying not just workers, but the country itself. General Motors responded with immediate resistance. In a blistering statement, executives warned that such a tariff would force the company to freeze all future investments in American plants. They argued that the tariff plan would disrupt operations, threaten stability, and violate global trade norms. Behind closed doors, GM lobbyists launched a full-scale blitz on Capitol Hill, reminding legislators how many jobs their factories still provided. As the conflict escalated, so did the stakes. Trump's team floated the idea of targeting corporate subsidies, suggesting any company offshoring over 30% of production would lose eligibility for federal contracts and EV tax credits. In response, GM hinted that it might pull out of federal green energy initiatives entirely, including upcoming EV projects meant to power American government fleets. Suddenly, the battle over Chevrolet had become the defining political clash of the 2026 election. Was economic nationalism a principle to be enforced, or just a slogan for rallies? Trump's challenge had forced the issue, and with blue-collar voters watching, GM found itself facing not just public anger, but regulatory revenge. Yet beyond the political theatrics, a quieter, deeper question was forming in homes, factories, and boardrooms across the nation. Final verdict: Chevrolet's decision may have shocked Americans, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. It emerged from decades of industrial decline, global competition, and political trade-offs. Still, for many watching, the numbers feel secondary to the meaning. $48.10 billion in frozen production is staggering, but it's the symbolism that haunts people more than the spreadsheets. Can a brand that built its legacy on American pride survive when that pride is publicly fractured? Should Chevrolet be forced to bring jobs back? Or is the globalized economy too far gone to reverse? These are not just policy debates. They're existential questions about who we are and what we value as a country. Because what's being lost isn't just domestic production. It's trust. It's identity. It's the cultural glue that once made the phrase "Made in America" mean something more than a location. It meant loyalty. Chevrolet was never just a car brand. It was a symbol on wheels, built into childhood memories, family road trips, and working-class dreams. For millions, it still is. But the soul of that symbol is now contested. Some Americans say the market should decide. Others argue it's time for government to draw a line. But one truth is clear: the middle ground is shrinking. What began as a factory shutdown has become a referendum on globalization, industrial policy, and national purpose. So what happens now? The strikes may continue, tariffs may rise, GM may backtrack or dig in. But whatever comes next, this isn't just about jobs or politics. It's about a line in the sand. What just happened wasn't a business adjustment, it was a warning. And if this is the future of American industry, we need to talk about it loudly. What just happened wasn't a business adjustment, it was a warning. And if this is the future of American industry, we need to talk about it loudly. Leave a comment if your town, your job, or your trust in these brands has been affected. And if you want more hard-hitting breakdowns like this, subscribe, because this isn't just content, this is accountability.